I always thought I knew what betrayal looked like. I thought it would come from some nameless, faceless stranger, a shadowy figure lurking on the edges of our life, slipping in to shatter everything we'd built. But it wasn't a stranger. It was Mike. Mike, who had been my friend since we were kids. Mike, who'd been there through every milestone, our high school graduation, my wedding day, the birth of my first son. Mike, who had been a part of every Christmas, every backyard barbecue, every quiet weekend spent around a fire. He was family in all but name, the brother I never had. And now, I had to say his name through gritted teeth. Now, I couldn't picture his face without feeling a wave of nausea and rage. It started with a nagging feeling. You know, the kind you try to brush off because it doesn't make sense, because you trust the people in your life, because you have no reason to think otherwise. But sometimes, your gut knows things your mind hasn't caught up to yet. I started noticing how Liz would light up when Mike came around, in a way that felt different. She'd laugh a little too hard at his jokes, her eyes lingering on him a little too long. I told myself I was imagining it, that I was reading too much into something innocent. I ignored it. After all, they were close. We were all close. But over the months, it got harder to ignore. The little things added up. Late-night texts from Liz that she'd quickly hide when I walked into the room. Her sudden need for space, for me time, a phrase that had never been part of her vocabulary before. I'd catch them in hushed conversations that went silent the moment I stepped into the room. I told myself they were probably just discussing something private, maybe even a surprise for me. Mike and Liz had always been friendly. They'd known each other nearly as long as Liz and I had been together. Why would I question it? Still, the doubts grew louder. I found myself analyzing every interaction, every smile, every glance. I hated myself for it. This wasn't who I wanted to be. I didn't want to be the kind of man who questioned his wife, who doubted his best friend. But the suspicion became like a thorn in my mind, impossible to ignore. Then, one night, the truth found me in the worst possible way. Liz and I had gone to bed early, but I'd woken up around midnight. She wasn't there. At first, I thought she'd gone to check on the kids or maybe get a drink of water. But minutes passed, and she didn't come back. I slipped out of bed, quietly moving through the house, my bare feet padding down the hallway. I found her in the living room, sitting on the edge of the couch with her phone in her hand, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the screen. She was so focused, so engrossed, that she didn't hear me at first. She was typing something, her fingers moving quickly, a look of deep concentration on her face. I stepped closer, not trying to hide my presence, and that's when she looked up. The look on her face told me everything. She stared at me like a deer caught in headlights, her expression a mixture of guilt and fear, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. "Who are you texting?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. I could feel my heart pounding, the blood rushing in my ears. She didn't answer. Her eyes darted away, as if looking at me hurt too much. And that's when I knew. I knew before she even opened her mouth, before she tried to explain, before the tears filled her eyes. I knew, deep down, that everything I'd been pushing away, everything I'd been trying not to believe, was true. It's not what you think," she stammered, her voice shaky, her hands trembling. But I could see the truth in her eyes, the guilt, the regret, and maybe even a hint of defiance, like she was bracing herself for what she knew was coming. "Is it Mike?" I asked, my voice sharper now, the anger bubbling up from somewhere deep inside me, somewhere I didn't know I had. Her silence was answer enough. She looked away, pressing her lips together, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, and I could hear the truth in her words, the pain in her voice. But it wasn't enough. Nothing she could say would be enough. I felt something break inside me, something I didn't even know was fragile. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in, and I realized I was struggling to breathe. I'd trusted her. I'd trusted both of them. These were the two people I cared about most in the world, the two people who were supposed to be by my side, who I thought would never hurt me. How long? I asked, my voice raw. She hesitated, her hands twisting in her lap. It just happened. A few weeks ago. It wasn't supposed to happen. We never meant to hurt you. I almost laughed at that. Never meant to hurt me. They'd been lying to my face, keeping secrets right under my nose, betraying me in a way I couldn't even wrap my mind around. The betrayal wasn't just about my wife finding comfort in another man. It was about my best friend, the man who'd stood beside me through everything, stealing a piece of my life right out from under me. I couldn't listen to any more. Without another word, I turned and walked out, leaving her sitting there in the dark, her quiet sobs filling the silence behind me. I went to the guest room, shut the door, and sat on the edge of the bed, my mind racing, my heart pounding. In that moment, I felt completely, utterly alone. The two people I thought would never betray me had shattered my trust in a way that felt irreparable. And I had no idea what to do next. The next morning, I woke up in a haze, the events of the night before replaying in my mind like a bad dream. But as the fog of sleep faded, the pain remained sharp and real, rooted in my chest like a weight pressing down on me. I lay there for a few minutes, staring up at the ceiling, trying to gather the strength to face the day. The thought of seeing Liz, of seeing her and knowing what she'd done, felt unbearable. And yet, I couldn't avoid her. This was my life. My house. My marriage. I didn't have the option of turning away. When I finally left the guest room, the house was quiet. The kids were at a friend's house for the weekend, thank God. The last thing I wanted was for them to see us like this, to feel the tension thickening the air. I found Liz in the kitchen, sitting at the table with her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, staring down at it as if it held the answers to everything she'd broken. She looked up as I entered, her eyes red-rimmed and puffy. I could tell she hadn't slept. Good, I thought bitterly, though the satisfaction was hollow. I wanted her to feel the weight of what she'd done. I wanted her to hurt, just a fraction of what I was feeling. But I knew that whatever pain she felt, it could never match mine. She was the one who chose this. I poured myself a cup of coffee, each movement mechanical, just something to fill the silence. I didn't say anything, just waited, letting the silence hang heavy between us. Finally, she spoke, her voice small and broken. Ben, I'm so sorry. I know. I know that doesn't fix anything, but I need you to know how sorry I am. I never wanted this to happen. I never wanted to hurt you. I clenched my jaw, my grip tightening around the coffee mug. You never wanted to hurt me? I repeated, my voice laced with anger and disbelief. Liz, you were sneaking around with Mike, of all people. You had to know how much that would destroy me. She looked down, her hands shaking. I know. I know, and I can't even explain why it happened. I was lonely. I felt, I don't know, disconnected. And he was there. He understood me in a way I felt like you didn't. Those words stung more than I expected, each one like a dagger twisting in my chest. I wanted to argue, to tell her that I'd always been there, that if she'd just talked to me, maybe we could have fixed things. But I could feel the bitterness rising in my throat, the rage threatening to spill over. So, what? I said, my voice cold. Instead of talking to me, you decided to go behind my back. With my best friend? She flinched, the guilt and shame etched into her face. It wasn't planned, Ben. I swear. I didn't wake up one day and decide to betray you. It just happened. I know that sounds like an excuse, but that's the truth. We were both feeling lost, I guess. And one night, it just crossed a line. I shook my head, the anger simmering just beneath the surface. You don't just cross a line, Liz. You made a choice. Both of you did. And you knew exactly what you were risking. Her eyes filled with tears, and she looked away, unable to meet my gaze. I know. I know. And if I could take it back, I would. But I can't. The reality of it settled over me like a dark cloud. There was no going back. No way to erase the betrayal, no way to unsee what I'd seen. I'd trusted her. I'd trusted Mike. And now that trust was shattered, lying in pieces around us. As if on cue, my phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. I glanced at the screen and felt a fresh wave of anger surge through me. It was Mike. I ignored it, watching the screen as his name disappeared. But a few seconds later, it buzzed again. And again. Finally, I grabbed it, walking out onto the back porch, away from Liz. I answered, my voice tight with barely contained rage. What the hell do you want? There was a pause, then Mike's voice came through, strained and hesitant. Ben, we need to talk. Please, just give me a chance to explain. Explain. I spat, my grip tightening around the phone. Explain what, Mike? That you betrayed me? That you took advantage of the fact that I trusted you? I don't need an explanation. I need you to stay the hell away from me and my family. Please, Ben, he said, his voice pleading. I'm not calling to make excuses. I know I messed up. I know I broke something that we may never be able to fix. But I need you to hear me out. I can't just let this end like this, without you knowing how sorry I am. Sorry. I laughed bitterly, glancing back through the window where Liz was still sitting, her head in her hands. You think sorry is going to fix this? You destroyed everything, Mike. You were like a brother to me. And now I can't even look at you. There was a long silence on the other end. I could hear him struggling for words, as if he was realizing that there was nothing he could say to make this right. And maybe that was the truth. Some things couldn't be repaired. Some things, once broken, just stayed broken. Ben, he finally said, his voice cracking. I know you'll probably never forgive me. I know that. But if there's any way, if there's any chance. I just want to make things right. I don't know how, but I want to try. Make things right? I repeated, feeling an overwhelming wave of disgust. You took everything from me, Mike. You took my trust, my friendship, my marriage, and you threw it all away. Do you even understand what you've done? He was silent, and I could hear the faint sound of him breathing, like he was holding back tears. I understand, Ben. And I know I don't deserve anything from you. I wanted you to hear me say it. I'm sorry. I ended the call without another word, my hand shaking as I shoved the phone back in my pocket. I stood there on the porch, staring out at the yard, my mind spinning. The betrayal from Liz hurt, but Mike's betrayal felt like a wound that would never heal. He was supposed to be family, the one person who I thought would never hurt me. And now, I felt like I'd lost two people, two relationships, in a single night. When I finally went back inside, Liz was still sitting at the kitchen table, her face tear-streaked, her hands folded tightly in front of her. She looked up as I entered, her expression a mixture of guilt, regret, and hope. She was waiting for me to say something, to tell her if there was any chance left for us. But I didn't have an answer. Not yet. Not while the wounds were still fresh, raw, bleeding. All I knew was that the life I'd thought was so stable, so unshakable, was now in ruins. And I had no idea how, or if, it could ever be put back together. The days that followed felt like they were passing in slow motion, each one stretching out, filled with an unbearable weight. I went through the motions of work, of chores, of life itself, but I felt like I was moving underwater. Everything around me was distorted, muted. Every interaction with Liz was stiff and hollow, as if we were two strangers sharing a house. She tried, in her way, leaving me notes, making my favorite meals, even attempting small talk when she could tell I was struggling. But I couldn't give her anything in return. I couldn't bring myself to sleep in the same bed. Every time I lay down next to her, I'd picture her with Mike. I didn't want to imagine it, but my mind kept looping back to it like a song I couldn't shake. I kept seeing them together, kept picturing every moment they'd shared behind my back. I didn't know what hurt more, the betrayal itself, or the fact that they'd hidden it from me for so long. And then there was Mike. He called a few more times, but I ignored every attempt. Eventually, the calls stopped, and I felt a mixture of relief and disappointment. A part of me wanted him to keep trying, wanted him to come crawling, begging for forgiveness. But another part of me wanted him gone from my life forever. I didn't want to hear his voice. I didn't want to see his face. The man I'd trusted with everything, my confidant, my best friend, had shattered every ounce of that trust. I couldn't imagine a world where I'd ever want to be in the same room with him again. A few days after the discovery, Liz came to me, her face drawn and pale, her eyes hollow with regret. She had that look about her that I used to recognize as her serious look, the one she got whenever she was going to say something important. But this time, it felt empty. Whatever we once had, the connection, the spark, had been dulled by what she'd done. "Ben," she said softly, reaching out as if to touch my arm but stopping short. "Please. Can we talk?" I looked at her, the woman I'd promised to spend my life with, and for the first time, I didn't know who she was. The woman in front of me looked like my wife, sounded like her, but I couldn't reconcile that image with the person who'd betrayed me. I couldn't connect this face with the one who'd chosen my best friend over me. "What is there left to say?" I asked, my voice flat, devoid of emotion. "You made your choice, Liz. You chose him. You chose to lie to me, to go behind my back with someone I trusted more than anyone." She winced, her eyes filling with fresh tears. "I didn't choose him over you, Ben. It wasn't like that. It just happened. I know that's not what you want to hear, but I never stopped loving you. I never stopped wanting our life together." I shook my head, a bitter laugh escaping me. "You never stopped loving me? How am I supposed to believe that, Liz? How am I supposed to believe you cared about me at all when you were sneaking around with him? You can't tell me you love me and then turn around and do that." She pressed her lips together, looking down, her shoulders slumping. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness. I know I have no right to ask you to stay. But I want to try to make this right. I want to fight for us, if you'll let me." Her words felt like they were floating in a haze, reaching me but not quite connecting. I didn't know what to say. The part of me that had once loved her fiercely was buried so deeply beneath the layers of hurt and betrayal that I didn't know if it could ever surface again. That night, I drove to a quiet bar on the edge of town, needing some kind of escape. I ordered a drink and sat alone at the counter, staring into my glass, lost in thought. I kept wondering how I'd ended up here, in this place of heartbreak and confusion, wondering how my life had turned into something I barely recognized. Halfway through my drink, my phone buzzed. I pulled it out, expecting another message from Liz, another plea for forgiveness or a promise to make things right. But it wasn't from her. It was from Mike. "I know you don't want to hear from me. But please, meet me. Just once. I owe you an explanation." My first instinct was to delete the message, to pretend I hadn't seen it. But something stopped me. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the need for closure, or maybe it was just the anger festering inside me, looking for an outlet. Whatever it was, I found myself typing a response before I could talk myself out of it. "Fine. Tomorrow. The park near my house. 5 p.m. When I hit send, I felt a strange mixture of dread and relief. This was it, the confrontation I hadn't allowed myself to have. The chance to look him in the eyes and demand answers. To ask him how he could betray me like that, how he could live with himself after destroying everything we'd built. The next day, I arrived at the park early, the cool evening air settling around me as I paced back and forth, my mind racing. I didn't know what I would say. I didn't know if I'd yell, if I'd stay calm, if I'd be able to hold it together at all. All I knew was that I needed to see him, needed to face him one last time. A few minutes after 5, I saw him approaching. He looked different. Smaller, somehow. His shoulders were slumped, his face drawn and pale. For a moment, I saw the friend I'd once known, the man who'd been there for me through everything. But that feeling faded as quickly as it came, replaced by the sharp reminder of what he'd done. He stopped a few feet away from me, his hands shoved into his pockets, his gaze downcast. "Ben," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you for meeting me." I stared at him, feeling the anger bubbling up, a tightness in my throat that I couldn't release. "Why?" I asked, my voice rough. "Why did you do it, Mike?" He looked up, meeting my gaze, and I could see the regret etched into his face. "I don't have a good answer, Ben. I wish I did. I wish I could tell you that it was some mistake, some momentary lapse of judgment. But the truth is, I was selfish. I was weak. And I envied you. Envied me?" I repeated, my fists clenching. "What the hell does that even mean?" He took a shaky breath, struggling to find the words. "You had everything I wanted, Ben. The marriage, the family, the stability. And I was lonely. Liz and we connected over things I couldn't tell you, things I thought you wouldn't understand. We leaned on each other, and one night, it crossed a line. I felt the bile rise in my throat. So you betrayed me because you were jealous? Because you thought my life was something to envy?" He nodded, his face twisted with shame. "I know it sounds pathetic. And it is. I don't have an excuse. I got lost in it. I convinced myself that what I was feeling was real. But it wasn't. It was a mistake, the biggest mistake of my life." I looked at him, the man I'd trusted, the man who'd been like a brother to me, and I felt a deep, hollow sadness settle over me. This was the end of something I thought would last forever. Our friendship, my marriage, the stability I'd taken for granted, all of it had crumbled. I shook my head, the words spilling out before I could stop them. "I don't think I can ever forgive you, Mike. I don't think I can even look at you without feeling sick." He nodded slowly, his shoulders sagging. "I understand. And I don't blame you. I wanted you to know that I'm sorry. That I hate myself for what I did." There was nothing left to say. I turned and walked away, leaving him standing there in the growing darkness, his figure fading behind me. As I walked home, the weight of it all pressed down on me, the reality of the betrayal settling in. I didn't know where to go from here. I didn't know if I could ever rebuild what had been broken, if I could ever trust again. All I knew was that the life I'd had, the people I'd loved, were gone. And I was left to pick up the pieces alone. After that meeting with Mike, something inside me shifted. I'd been carrying around this weight, this hope that maybe he'd give me some answer that would make it all make sense, some explanation that could soften the edges of what he and Liz had done. But standing there, listening to him stumble over his hollow apologies and pathetic excuses, I realized the truth: there was no explanation that would ever make this right. No reason good enough to justify the betrayal of two people I'd trusted with my life. In the days that followed, I stopped waiting for things to feel normal again. The life I'd once known, the marriage I'd thought was solid, was gone. And maybe it had been gone for a while, slipping through my fingers while I was too busy, too comfortable, to notice. I didn't know if there was anything left to rebuild, or if I even wanted to try. All I knew was that I couldn't stay frozen in this anger, this sadness, any longer. I had to start moving forward, even if I had no idea where that would lead. Liz could sense the change in me. I still couldn't bring myself to sleep in our bed, still couldn't bring myself to share more than a few necessary words with her each day, but I think she could tell that something had shifted. She stopped trying to apologize, stopped filling the silence with tearful promises and desperate attempts at small talk. She just, let me be, and maybe that was the one thing I needed from her. One evening, about a week after my talk with Mike, Liz asked me to sit down with her. I could tell by the look on her face that this wasn't going to be another apology, another plea for forgiveness. She seemed nervous, her hands wringing together in her lap, her eyes downcast. "Ben," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I don't know if there's any way back for us. I don't know if you'll ever be able to forgive me, or if I even deserve that. But I think it's time we talked about what happens next. About the future. The future." It felt like such a foreign concept, like something I wasn't ready to face yet. But she was right. We couldn't just exist in this purgatory of resentment and silence forever. Eventually, we'd have to make a decision, one way or another. "I don't know what you want me to say, Liz," I replied, my voice rough. "I'm still so angry. I still can't look at you without feeling everything. I don't know if I can ever get past this." She nodded, swallowing hard. "I understand. And if you think that divorce is the only way, I'll respect that. I don't want to keep you in a marriage that's become this." The word divorce hung heavy in the air, a possibility we'd both been dancing around but hadn't dared to say out loud. I thought about what it would mean, the logistics, the conversations with the kids, the uprooting of everything familiar. I thought about the life we'd built together, the memories, the years we'd invested. But as much as I hated the idea of giving up on it all, I couldn't ignore the reality of what had happened. I couldn't ignore the betrayal that had turned our marriage into a shell of what it used to be. "I don't know if I'm ready to make that choice," I said finally, rubbing my temples. "But I also don't know if I can keep living like this. I feel like a stranger in my own home. I feel like I don't even know who you are anymore, Liz." She flinched, looking down. "I know. And I know I'm the one who destroyed that trust. I can't change the past, Ben. I can't undo what I did. But I want you to know that I'll support whatever decision you make. If that means letting you go, then I'll let you go. You deserve to be happy." Her words felt sincere, but I didn't know if they were enough. Part of me wanted to take her at her word, to believe that maybe, somehow, we could work through this. But another part of me, the part that felt broken beyond repair, wasn't sure I could ever trust her again. And then there was the thought of the kids. We hadn't told them anything. They were too young to understand the details, but they were old enough to notice the tension, the cold silence that had replaced our once warm home. I didn't want them to grow up in a household where their parents could barely look at each other, but I also didn't want them to think that betrayal, that lies, were things that could just be brushed aside. That night, I lay awake in the guest room, thinking about my life, my marriage, my family. I thought about what it would mean to start over, to build something new from the ashes of what Liz and Mike had destroyed. I thought about the loneliness, the pain, the uncertainty of the path that lay ahead, no matter which choice I made. And in the silence of the night, a thought came to me that I hadn't considered before: maybe healing didn't mean staying or leaving. Maybe healing was something I had to do for myself, no matter what happened with Liz or with Mike. Maybe forgiveness wasn't about letting them off the hook, but about letting myself move on, letting myself be free of the anger that was eating me alive. In the morning, I asked Liz if she'd be willing to go to therapy with me. Not because I knew I wanted to stay, but because I wanted clarity. I wanted to understand where we'd gone wrong, to face the wounds we'd inflicted on each other, whether or not we stayed together in the end. She agreed without hesitation, relief evident in her eyes. I could tell she was clinging to any hope, any chance, that we might be able to rebuild. And maybe a small part of me wanted that too, even if I wasn't ready to admit it yet. Our first session was painful. I went in with my walls up, expecting to just sit there, let her talk, and maybe throw in a few bitter words of my own. But the therapist had a way of cutting through the bitterness, of helping me see my own pain without letting it consume me. She asked questions I hadn't considered, questions about the marriage before the affair, about the subtle distance that had grown between Liz and me even before Mike became part of the equation. I listened as Liz described her loneliness, her feelings of being overlooked, of slipping into the background of my life. And though I hated to admit it, I could see glimpses of truth in her words. I'd been so focused on providing, on being the perfect husband, in every practical way, that I'd forgotten to actually be there. I'd taken for granted that she'd always be there waiting for me, no matter how often I put work or my own interests ahead of her. But none of that excused what she'd done. None of it justified the betrayal. When the therapist asked me what I wanted, I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that I didn't want to feel this way anymore. I didn't want to be defined by the anger, the hurt, the betrayal that had seeped into every part of my life. At the end of the session, the therapist gave us an exercise, to spend a few minutes each night talking to each other, without bringing up the past or the pain. Just small talk, an attempt to reconnect on a basic level. I didn't know if it would help, but I agreed, if only to see if there was anything left between us worth saving. The first night, the silence was almost unbearable. We sat across from each other in the living room, both of us tense, awkward, unsure. Liz started talking about her day, some small, mundane details about work, about a book she'd started reading. I nodded, giving short, non-committal answers, feeling like I was talking to a stranger. But she kept going, her words filling the empty space, slowly easing the tension. It wasn't much. It didn't feel like progress. But it felt like something. A tiny crack in the wall we'd both built around ourselves. As I listened to her, really listened, I found myself wondering if maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for us to rebuild. Not to go back to what we were, but to create something new, something more honest, more real. I didn't know if I was ready to forgive her. I didn't know if I'd ever be ready to forgive Mike. But as I sat there, listening to the familiar cadence of her voice, I felt the faintest flicker of hope, a fragile, tentative hope that maybe, in time, I could find my way back to myself. And maybe, if we were both willing to face the pain, we could find our way back to each other. Therapy became a routine. Every week, Liz and I would sit in that quiet office, facing each other with a mix of resentment and vulnerability, peeling back the layers of hurt and mistrust we'd built up over the years. The therapist helped us go deeper, past the anger and bitterness, past the betrayal itself, to the underlying issues we'd both ignored for so long. Sometimes it felt like we were reliving every painful memory, every disappointment we'd buried in our marriage. Other times, it felt like we were rebuilding something fragile, piece by piece. The exercises she gave us, like spending a few minutes each night just talking, were difficult at first. But gradually, they became a part of our lives. We started having small conversations over dinner, laughing a little at memories of the kids when they were younger, or even reminiscing about the early years of our marriage, back when everything felt simple, back before the resentment and distance took root. It felt strange, like we were reconnecting with ghosts of our former selves, finding small glimmers of the bond we used to share. But there was always that shadow. No matter how much we tried to talk about the present, the betrayal loomed large, like a stain we couldn't scrub out. Every time I'd start to feel a moment of closeness with her, I'd remember that night I'd found her texting Mike, the look on her face when I confronted her, the lies she'd told me to cover her tracks. I could feel myself putting up walls, even as we tried to let each other in. I was afraid to get too close, afraid that trusting her again would only open me up to more pain. One night, a few weeks into this new routine, she asked me a question that caught me off guard. "Do you think you could ever forgive me, Ben?" She asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. She looked so small, so uncertain, like she was bracing herself for the worst. I didn't answer right away. I looked down at my hands, trying to find the words. Forgiveness felt like such a huge, almost impossible concept. It wasn't just about saying, "I forgive you," and moving on. It was about letting go of the anger, the betrayal, the hurt. It was about trusting her again, letting myself be vulnerable with her again. And I didn't know if I could ever truly do that. "I don't know," I admitted, finally looking up at her. "I want to, but it's hard, Liz. Every time I try to move forward, I keep seeing the two of you together in my mind. I keep thinking about what you did, what you both did. And it's like, there's this wall between us now. I don't know if I can ever break it down completely." Her face crumpled, and I saw tears welling up in her eyes. She reached across the table, taking my hand in hers, and I let her, though I didn't return the pressure. "I know I hurt you, Ben. I know I shattered your trust, and I know it's my fault. But I love you. I've always loved you. And I'll do whatever it takes, however long it takes, to show you that you can trust me again." The sincerity in her voice cut through me. I wanted to believe her, wanted to feel that her words could be enough to bridge the chasm between us. But trust, once broken, wasn't something that could just be rebuilt with promises. It needed time, effort, and, maybe something I wasn't ready to give yet. The therapist had told me that forgiveness wasn't just for Liz, that it was something I needed for myself. She said that carrying around this anger, this pain, would only poison me from the inside, would turn me into someone I didn't want to be. And as much as I hated to admit it, I could feel the truth of her words. The anger was eating away at me. It was keeping me up at night, driving a wedge between me and the kids, affecting my work, my friendships, everything. It was a weight that I couldn't keep carrying if I wanted to find peace. A week later, something happened that pushed me to face the anger head-on. I was at the grocery store, mindlessly picking up items for dinner, when I spotted a familiar face across the aisle. It was Mike. He looked up at the same time, and for a moment, we just stared at each other, frozen in place. He looked terrible. Thinner than I remembered, his face drawn and tired, his eyes dull with regret. He opened his mouth, as if to say something, but I turned away, heading in the opposite direction, my heart pounding. I didn't want to hear him. I didn't want to give him the satisfaction of saying anything to me. But he followed me, his footsteps close behind, his voice hesitant as he spoke. "Ben, please. Just give me a second." I stopped, gritting my teeth, my hands clenched into fists. I wanted to keep walking, to ignore him, but something in me snapped. I turned to face him, my expression hard. "What do you want, Mike? Haven't you done enough?" He winced, looking down, shame written all over his face. "I know I have. And I'm not here to. I don't know, make excuses or try to win you back. I needed you to know that I'm sorry. I'm truly, deeply sorry. Losing you, losing our friendship, it's the worst thing that's ever happened to me." "Good," I said, the word coming out sharper than I intended. "You should feel that way. You betrayed me. You didn't just ruin my marriage, you destroyed a friendship that meant everything to me. How am I supposed to just get over that?" He nodded, looking down at his shoes. "I don't expect you to. I don't think I'll ever forgive myself, and I know you probably never will either. I wanted to say it. I wanted you to know that I regret it every day." I stared at him, my mind swirling with a mixture of anger, sadness, and something I couldn't quite identify. He looked so broken, so different from the man I used to call my best friend. And in that moment, I realized that holding on to this anger was hurting me more than it was hurting him. He already seemed to be paying the price, already haunted by what he'd done. My rage wasn't changing anything, it was only keeping me trapped in the past. I took a deep breath, feeling the tension in my chest loosen, if only slightly. You know what, Mike? I don't forgive you. I don't know if I ever will. But I can't keep carrying this hatred. I'm done with it. You can live with what you've done, and I'll live with the damage you left behind. He nodded, a single tear slipping down his face. Thank you, Ben. I know that doesn't mean anything, but thank you for hearing me out. Without another word, I turned and walked away, leaving him standing there in the grocery store aisle. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated. But I felt lighter. Like I'd finally put down a weight I'd been carrying for too long. That night, I told Liz about the encounter. She listened quietly, nodding as I recounted what I'd said, what he'd said. When I was done, she reached out, her hand gently covering mine. I'm proud of you, she said softly. I know that couldn't have been easy. I shrugged, feeling a strange mixture of relief and sadness. I don't know if it changes anything. But it felt like the right thing to do. In that moment, I realized that maybe forgiveness wasn't about erasing what had happened. It wasn't about pretending things could go back to the way they were. It was about letting go of the past, making room for whatever came next, whether that was with Liz or on my own. We sat there in silence, her hand in mine, the smallest glimmer of hope between us. For the first time, I felt like maybe, just maybe, I was ready to start moving forward. Not for her, not for Mike, but for myself. After my encounter with Mike, something shifted inside me. I'd spent so many weeks lost in a fog of anger, resentment, and betrayal, consumed by what he and Liz had done. But walking away from him in that grocery store, leaving him standing there with his shame and regret, gave me a sense of freedom I hadn't felt since this nightmare began. I still didn't forgive him, probably never would, but I'd let go of the need to hold on to the pain as tightly as I had been. For the first time, I felt like I had some control over my own healing. When I got home that night, Liz and I had a quiet dinner together, and afterward, we sat on the couch, sipping tea in silence. There was something almost peaceful in that silence, as if we'd reached an understanding. We were both tired, both carrying the weight of what had happened, but maybe we didn't have to carry it alone. She looked at me, her face softened by the dim light of the lamp, and finally spoke. I know I've asked you this before, but, do you think there's any chance for us, Ben? I know it won't be the same, and I don't expect it to be. But do you think we can build something new? I took a deep breath, feeling the familiar ache in my chest. I didn't have an answer, not really, but I knew that walking away from her didn't feel right either. We'd been through so much together. She was my wife, the mother of my children, and despite everything, I still felt something. A connection that had been stretched thin, frayed nearly to the breaking point, but hadn't snapped completely. I don't know, I admitted, my voice quiet but steady. But I think I want to try. The relief on her face was palpable. Her eyes filled with tears, and she reached over, gently taking my hand. Thank you, she whispered. I know I don't deserve it, but, thank you. I promise you, Ben, I'll do everything I can to make this right. In that moment, I realized that trying didn't mean forgetting. It didn't mean pretending the betrayal hadn't happened or sweeping it under the rug. Trying meant acknowledging the pain, letting ourselves feel it, and then choosing, each day, to keep moving forward. It would be slow, it would be hard, and some days it would feel impossible. But as I sat there with her, I felt a flicker of hope, something fragile but real. We kept going to therapy, digging deeper into the things we'd avoided for so long. The therapist helped us see the cracks that had formed in our marriage long before the affair, the ways we'd both failed each other, the resentment and distance that had been building in the background. It was painful to confront, to see the ways I'd taken her for granted, how I'd assumed she'd always be there, waiting for me, no matter how much I neglected her emotional needs. But understanding those things didn't excuse what she'd done. It didn't erase the betrayal or make it hurt any less. It just made me see her as human, as flawed and struggling in ways I hadn't wanted to acknowledge. And as I began to let go of the anger, I realized that maybe forgiveness wasn't about saying, "It's okay." Maybe forgiveness was just about accepting what had happened and allowing ourselves to start over, scarred but wiser. One day, a few months later, she brought up an idea that surprised me. "Ben," she said, as we sat on the back porch one evening, watching the sunset. "I think it might be good for us to get away. Just the two of us. Maybe a weekend trip, somewhere quiet. Somewhere we can focus on us." I stared out at the fading light, considering her words. The idea of going away together, of putting ourselves in a space where we'd have nothing to distract us from each other, was both terrifying and strangely appealing. Part of me wanted to avoid it, to stay wrapped up in the safety of routine. But another part of me, the part that was tired of feeling numb, wanted to take that risk. "Okay," I said, finally turning to look at her. "Let's try it." We chose a small cabin by a lake, a few hours' drive from home. It was the kind of place we'd gone to years ago, back when we were still discovering each other, back when things had felt easy and carefree. I wasn't expecting magic. I wasn't expecting to find some instant fix. But as we settled into the quiet rhythm of the weekend, cooking together, walking by the lake, sitting by the fire in silence, I felt some of the tension between us start to ease. On the second night, as we sat by the fire, Liz looked over at me, her eyes serious. "There's something I need to say," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know that. I don't deserve your trust. I know that I hurt you in ways that will never fully heal. But I need you to know that I'm committed to this. I'm committed to rebuilding our marriage, to earning your trust, no matter how long it takes. I'm not going anywhere, Ben. Not unless you tell me to." Her words sank in, wrapping around my heart in a way I hadn't expected. I nodded, swallowing hard. "I want to believe that, Liz. I really do. And I'm trying. But, it's going to take time. I don't know if I can ever forget what happened. But I do know that I want to try." She reached out, hesitantly, as if afraid I might pull away. Her fingers brushed mine, and I let her take my hand, feeling the warmth of her touch, the familiar comfort I'd been denying myself for so long. We sat there, holding hands in silence, letting the fire crackle and the night settle around us. The weekend wasn't a miracle cure. It didn't erase the pain or magically restore everything that had been broken. But it gave us a glimpse of what could be possible, a relationship not defined by the past, but by the choices we made going forward. I knew there would still be hard days, days when the memories of betrayal would creep back in, when the anger and hurt would resurface. But I also knew that we had a chance to rebuild, piece by painful piece. When we returned home, I felt a renewed sense of purpose, a quiet determination to keep trying, to keep choosing her despite everything. We continued therapy, continued our nightly conversations, continued finding small ways to reconnect. It was a long, difficult process, but every now and then, I'd catch glimpses of the woman I'd fallen in love with, the way she laughed, the way she looked at me when she thought I wasn't watching, the way she seemed to find hope in every small step forward. Over time, the anger began to soften, turning into something more manageable, more distant. I still didn't forgive her completely, but I was learning to live with the scars, learning to accept them as part of our story. And I was beginning to see that maybe, just maybe, those scars didn't have to define us. They could be a reminder of what we'd survived, of the strength it took to rebuild something from the ashes. One night, as we lay in bed, I felt her hand slip into mine, her fingers lacing through mine in the darkness. I squeezed her hand, feeling the warmth of her beside me, and in that moment, I felt a quiet sense of peace settle over me. We weren't perfect. We were still healing, still learning how to trust each other again. But we were moving forward, step by small step, together. And as I drifted off to sleep, I realized that maybe, just maybe, that was enough.